Use space-based technology 20 to 30 times between the time we get up and have breakfast. It's digital maps, it's bank transactions, stock trades, cell phone calls. We're all depending on it. But Russia, China, other countries are launching attacks in space designed to damage or destroy U.S. satellites and interfere with the technology they rely on. So, Space Force, the newest branch of the U.S. military, is now fighting every day to defend those technologies. My team and I got exclusive access to see how it all works and how dangerous it's becoming up there. Inside Mission Control at Buckley Space Force Base in Aurora, Colorado, Space Force Guardians, as they're known, fly the nation's missile warning satellites. Using infrared sensors, these satellites, orbiting 22,000 miles above Earth, scour the planet 24/7 for missile launches and nuclear detonations.
We never stop, always vigilant, and we've never failed, because that's how important this mission is to our nation. We provide decision quality data to tactical warfighters on the ground to save their lives.
This satellite dish is in touch with missile warning satellites deployed in what's known as geosynchronous orbit. If those warning satellites detect a launch anywhere on the surface of the planet, it beams that information back down to this ground station instantaneously at the speed of light. And then Space Force sends that information, that warning, around the world to U.S. forces deployed abroad or here on the U.S. homeland. In January 2020, these satellites sprang into action, detecting multiple missiles from Iran, targeting the Al-Assad airbase in Iraq. Before those missiles rained down, within minutes, Space Force had delivered a life-saving warning to U.S. units on the ground. Space Force Specialist Sally Stevens was on duty.
It is lightning fast.
Right, and quick enough for them to take action to protect themselves.
Absolutely, especially in the Al-Assad night. Not very often do we get reminded of where our data gets to, and that night was a shocking reality.
Missile warning satellites are just a fraction of the hundreds of U.S. government and commercial satellites monitored and defended by the guardians of the Space Force today. Defended because U.S. adversaries, led by Russia and China, have deployed weapons to disable or destroy them. Space Force is now an independent branch of the U.S. military due to this alarming new reality. Space, once relatively peaceful territory, is now considered a potential front in any modern war.
Space is a warfighting domain. It's the reason that we stood up the United States Space Force as a separate service. So each and every day, we're training our operators to deter conflict, but if deterrence fails, to compete and win in space.
The U.S. has far more satellites than any other nation, some 2,500 compared to 431 for China and 168 for Russia. And a whole range of U.S. military technologies depend on them. Satellites help warships and aircraft navigate and communicate.
Missile suspension released.
Help smart bombs and guided missiles hit their targets.
Spook 4-1, we got some sporters running up the ridgeline.
Help warfighters monitor threats on land, sea, and in the air.
There's nothing we do as a joint force, whether it's humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, or combat, that isn't enabled by space.
More than many Americans realize, civilian technologies are equally dependent on space. The nation's constellation of GPS satellites, flown by 2nd Space Operations Squadron at Schriever Space Force Base in Colorado Springs, is the backbone of multiple critical infrastructures.
The standard American people will probably use space 20 to 30 times between the moment they get up to the moment they have breakfast.
The financial sectors rely on positioning and timing information for precise banking operations and transactions. Our transportation sector for positioning and timing. Air, land, sea, and rail all rely on the global positioning system to be able to execute our critical infrastructure.
The job of defending the nearly 36 GPS satellites rests with a remarkably small team. 10 Guardians on duty at any time, outnumbered nearly 3 to 1 by the $500 million satellites they fly. Schriever Space Force Base has control over multiple constellations of U.S. satellites, every constellation with dozens of individual satellites, each providing capabilities such as GPS, secure military communications, and more, situational awareness in space. That is, keeping an eye on adversaries and weapons targeting U.S. space assets. The danger for the U.S. is that greater dependence on space equals greater vulnerability to attacks in space.
When you're at the top, The target's on your back. Everybody's shooting for you.
China is launching kidnapper satellites with grappling arms capable of plucking satellites out of orbit. Russia is deploying kamikaze satellites capable of ramming and destroying U.S. space assets. And Russia now has a new space weapon that Space Force dubs the nesting doll.
Back in 2017, Russia launched a satellite, and it opened up, and another satellite came up. And then it opened up, and a projectile came out. That projectile is designed to kill U.S. satellites. So in 2019, they did the same thing. But this time, they put it up next to one of our satellites. And then we started talking about it.
You warned them away.
We described what is safe and professional behavior, and it's important. Today, there's no rules in space. It's the wild, wild west.
Russia and China also have directed energy weapons, which can damage or disable U.S. satellites from a distance. The age of lasers in space has already arrived. New satellites are being designed with greater maneuverability, shielding to block directed energy weapons, and resiliency so that losing one or a few does not disable the entire system.
8, 7.
Space Force commanders welcome the private sector's entry into space since it gives more and cheaper options to get into orbit.
Ignition.
In June this year, the newest GPS satellite went up on a SpaceX rocket.
I would bet on the U.S. industry any day. It's a huge advantage that we have.
As for the U.S. weaponizing, Space Force wants to avoid a space arms race. Weapons are a last resort from the U.S. perspective.
We would prefer the domain to remain free of conflict. But like in any other domain, like air, land, sea, and now space, we'll be ready to protect and defend.
Adversaries have already attempted to use space weapons to temporarily disable U.S. satellites. Space war is not science fiction, but a battle already underway. These weapons, they're already floating around above our heads, in some cases thousands of miles above our heads. Not just kamikaze satellites and kidnapper satellites, but lasers in space as well. And that's what Space Force is being stood up for.